Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, November 28th, 2024, and Professor Marandi is here with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Let's get started with this temporary ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. Many people are asking right now why they have decided to go after a ceasefire when we're having a difficult situation in Gaza, and the situation in Gaza is not solved. What would be your response to this question?
Well, the resistance in Lebanon, they began, as we all know, on October the 8th last year, uh, shelling and striking border positions between Palestine and Lebanon in order to pull part of the Israeli military to the north and to prevent them from all going to Gaza. Because we all recall at that time the genocidal intent of the Israeli regime had become clear. They were calling Palestinians Amalek. The Minister of Defense or Minister of Genocide uh, said that they're going to cut off water, medicine, fuel, electricity, food, everything from Gaza. In other words, they wanted to starve the population. And the president of the regime said that there are no innocents in Gaza, and thus condemning everyone to death and starvation. So Hezbollah, in order to prevent that from happening and to help the resistance in Gaza, it began this conflict. It was a limited conflict, of course, and it continued, and it had huge impact. The Israeli regime was very angry. It displaced, there are different estimates, but probably somewhere between 80 to 150,000 people from northern Palestine. And that made things very difficult for the regime. Then, of course, we had the assassinations, the pager terror attack, which also injured the Iranian ambassador. And we also had the assassination of Sayed Hassan Nasrallah and Mr. Safieddin. And then the onslaught. The regime began an invasion of Lebanon, which failed. The Israeli regime failed on all accounts. However, we have to keep into account that the price that Lebanon has paid over, especially the last 2 months, is very high. Hezbollah, from the very beginning, kept the people of Lebanon out of this fight. For over 11 months, for almost a year, they kept this as a border conflict. And as a result, they gave more martyrs than they would have ordinarily, because they had to keep their fighters near the border, giving the Israeli regime greater opportunity to hit Hezbollah commandos and soldiers. And that was because Lebanon is a very complicated country. There are different religions, different sects. All these Beirut is full of Western embassies that are constantly conspiring against the resistance. You have lots of Western NGOs and Western institutions all conspiring against the resistance. And you have militias or former militias that are still armed, such as the Lebanese forces and others, which always conspire against Hezbollah. The head of the Lebanese forces and the Lebanese forces, the leaders itself, were among the people who carried out the Sabra and Shatila massacre, killing 3,500 Palestinians and Lebanese Shias in 1982 when the Israeli regime invaded the country and captured Beirut. They carried out this massacre with the Israelis. And these mass murderers are allies of Western embassies. So Hezbollah has to fight knowing that there's a dagger back there, and that they have to be careful not to be stabbed in the back. So it's not like Gaza, where at least in Gaza, Hamas and its allies, they have control of Gaza itself. In Lebanon, that's not the case. They are both external players and internal players. And so when the Israeli invasion began, Hezbollah was in a very difficult position. Its senior commanders and of course, Sayyid Hassan was martyred. They were martyred. And the Israelis, as in Gaza, they were targeting civilians. They were bombing cities, carpet bombing cities, towns, villages, especially communities that are supporters of the resistance, and those communities that were helping the refugees. You know, the Israelis seem to be looking for ways to carry out crimes in a new way. They're being innovative in their evilness. It's unbelievable, the sort of things that they would hunt down medics across Lebanon. They'd be searching for medics to kill them, and ambulance drivers. Not just, you know, bombing one if they happen to be there. They hunt for them across the country. So the people were under a great deal of pressure. And also, during these 2 months, there was a major conspiracy. They were conspiring against Hezbollah. The Western embassies, these NGOs, these institutions, these militias, they were working hard to undermine the resistance. They failed, fortunately, but this sort of pressure existed. So ultimately, I think Hezbollah accepted. Well, actually, Hezbollah has not accepted the ceasefire. Hezbollah has neither accepted or rejected the ceasefire. But a ceasefire has been accepted by the Lebanese side, which effectively means things are as they were before the 8th of October last year. Now, there's some small changes, but it's all manageable. To the south of the Litani River, Hezbollah never had arms before. There always was the army, and there was UNIFIL. Hezbollah's presence to the south of the river was always underground. And to the north, just like it is now, their presence was more open. So, but even to the north of the river, it's basically their key assets are all underground. So the Israeli regime has gained absolutely nothing. They've had some token changes in the agreements simply to say that we got something so that they could convince their people that they got something. But we have to keep in mind, so when it comes to Lebanon and the Israeli regime, it's a victory for Hezbollah, hands down, no doubt. But despite the fact that they slaughtered civilians and that the Hezbollah also gave martyrs, but they won because the regime failed. Well, despite Western support, despite the fact that you had American and German and British spies and ships and drones and planes working 24 hours a day, the Five Eyes, all, you know, everyone working with the Israeli regime. Despite all that, Hezbollah won, hands down. But obviously, it's not ideal. There are those who raise the question about the linking, let's say, of the battle in Lebanon and Gaza. There are a couple of things that can be said. One is that Hezbollah has not accepted the ceasefire, as I said. It has neither accepted or rejected it. It's done neither. Why is that significant? Because the Israeli regime will have to keep a very significant number of troops on the border, and especially during the next couple of months, but even afterwards, because Hezbollah has not taken a stance, and there's always a chance that the ceasefire will collapse or it won't be extended. And as we speak, Hezbollah is preparing. It is rearming itself. It's building new tunnels. It's working very swiftly to make up for any shortcomings it had, and to meet the needs of this type of warfare that they experienced over the last couple of months. And the Israeli regime knows that. So they're going to have to keep large amounts of their forces in the north. In addition to that, the Israeli regime and Hezbollah, both of them are constantly going to be looking to the sky, because within, I think, during Biden's presidency, and this is my own interpretation, this is my analysis, it's not based on evidence, but the Iranian operation against Israel will be carried out. Iran will not wait for a new president. This genocide and these attacks were carried out during the Biden years. The attack on Iran, the attacks on Iran, the violation of Iranian sovereignty were carried out during the Biden presidency. So my belief is that the Iranian strike will be soon, and it will be very significant. It will be much more significant than the previous strike. And I think the impact of it will be greater than the battles that we've seen so far. And also, I think, in addition to that, is the fact that the Israeli regime, in my opinion, will still be not in my opinion, it will still be directly in conflict with the other members of the Axis, not just Iran, which will carry out the operation against the Israeli regime, but also the resistance in Iraq and the resistance in Yemen. In other words, the gates to the Red Sea will remain closed, and drone and missile strikes from Yemen and Iraq will continue. Perhaps they will even increase, but we'll have to see. So this is something that the regime will have to take into consideration during the coming weeks if they want to intensify their attacks on Gaza. And I should also add that I have no doubt that the Iranians will continue to supply the resistance in Gaza in any way or form possible, and that is what they are doing. They have their ways, and I don't know how it's done, but they continue to support Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and their allies wherever they may be.
You mentioned the way that Hezbollah and Iranians and the people on the part of Gazans are thinking of this ceasefire. And how about the other part, the Israelis? Why have they decided to go with a ceasefire? What's the situation for them? How do you find the current state of their army, their political parties, their political attitude toward Lebanon?
I think there are a number of issues here. One is, I think that Biden is putting pressure on the Israeli regime, although I don't think everyone would agree with that. And I do think that Biden is angry with Netanyahu, and so is much of the deep state. And that deep state in the United States includes many Zionists. I think they're angry because Netanyahu was a reason for their defeat in the presidential election and in Congress and in the Senate. To what degree did it have an impact on their defeat? That is, I think, somewhat subjective. There are ways to figure that out to a degree. But what can be said is that it was a significant reason for their defeat. There are other reasons, but this was one. And so I think some of them wanted to punish him. I think they would like to see him fall. They would like to see the regime preserved, but I think there are many people who would like to see him fall. And Netanyahu is under a lot of criticism because the Channel 13 poll in Israel, which I tweeted, in that poll, 61% of those polled believed that the Israelis didn't win. Only 26% believed that they won. That's very significant. And Netanyahu has been attacked from people across the board very severely. So it's hurt Netanyahu, and that's why I think that this may have something to do with it. But also, the regime is overextended. It's the military is very tired. They're overextended. True, the Americans are covering all their costs. They are giving them whatever needs they have, whether it's ammunition or weapons, or aid, or loans, or whether it's political cover. I mean, even after the arrest warrants were issued, the ICC warrants, no one has been sanctioned. No one has stopped supplying Israel. The West is carrying out business as usual. And Netanyahu is carrying out a genocide not on his own. It's the political apparatus, it's the military, and the West continues to work with him, the military, and the political apparatus. So, but despite all that, the regime is exhausted. People are exhausted. The economy has collapsed. Israel is hated across the world. Its image has been tarnished, and Hezbollah has done an extraordinary job on the battlefield. After 2 months, the Israelis really got nowhere. And the deeper they would go in, the more dangerous it became for them, because what Hezbollah's biggest strength would be to constantly ambush the Israeli soldiers once they're deep inside Lebanon. That is what all these networks of tunnels are for. The Israelis never really got that far to get the real punishment. So they're exhausted. They were humiliated on the battlefield. Ordinary Israelis don't know this because they are fed regime propaganda, and Western media simply repeats Israeli propaganda. I was speaking to a very well-known journalist just yesterday, a Western journalist who Jewish, but critical of Israel, someone who you would know, and he was telling me that in London, in Washington, everyone believes the narrative that the Israelis destroyed Iran's air defenses and destroyed Iran's missile defense capabilities, and that Iran really is completely vulnerable now, and that we should go in and strike and take care of Iran, despite the fact that the air assault was a failure. Anyone who studies the situation, or has been in Iran, or just a witness in Tehran itself, would recognize that their main objective was Parchin, and nothing happened. But in the West, they believe the propaganda, and of course, Israelis believe their own propaganda, even though they're giving casualties and life is getting difficult. But at least for now, they're still under the influence. But the armed forces is exhausted, and people across the world were watching the Israelis fail. Those countries that would purchase Israeli weapons, those people in the region who thought that the Israeli regime was invincible. And of course, the Israelis would bomb apartment blocks, slaughter ordinary families, and that would outrage people, create outrage across the world, just like in Gaza. But then they'd see them be defeated on the battlefield, and they would see them still stuck on the border, and that was humiliating for the regime. And the more damaged their image becomes, the more vulnerable the regime becomes, because people across the region then start asking questions. People in Turkey say, Mr. Erdogan, why are you not doing anything? This is not a regime that's as strong as you thought, or that we thought. Or, why does King Abdullah of Jordan do nothing when the regime is failing in Lebanon, and so on? So it creates a lot of damage for the regime, and I think they needed this ceasefire. So in a sense, Hezbollah because of the complexities of Lebanon, they remain silent right now. Again, they haven't accepted or rejected the ceasefire, but the Israelis did need it because of their own problems.
Do you think that right after this, when they were talking in Israel about this ceasefire with Lebanon, Netanyahu said something different, that they want to focus on Iran, and how we can interpret the way that he's talking right now about Iran? Is that related to what's going on right now in Syria, or it's something beyond that?
Well, that is an important point. It is very interesting that a major attack has been carried out in Syria, and obviously there is coordination between Erdogan and Netanyahu, because this attack is in the interest of Netanyahu to weaken Syria, to weaken the bridge for the axis of resistance. And Erdogan has shown that he is no enemy of Netanyahu. He has refused to halt the Baku oil from going to Israel. Those who say it's the oil of Azerbaijan, he has more than enough influence over Aliyev to make him stop. There's no doubt about that. And after Netanyahu was declared to be a war criminal, carrying out crimes against humanity by the ICC, he had that excuse to halt the flow of oil, but he refused to do so. Trade continues despite claims otherwise. There's very strong evidence of that. And the political relationship exists. So the timing of the terrorists, these terror groups in Idlib, to restart this dirty war against Syria is very significant. It's very important. So that is a part of it. I think that the Israelis want to weaken Syria so that if there is conflict again in Lebanon, that it would be more difficult for the resistance. And also, Syria is supporting the Palestinians in the West Bank. That would make it all the more difficult for them as well. There's no doubt that that's true. With regards to a direct attack between Israel and Iran, Hezbollah really doesn't play a role, because these would be airstrikes and missile strikes that Iran would carry out, or the Israeli regime would carry out, and that has nothing to do with what is going on what was going on the border between Palestine and Lebanon. So I think that this is quite probable. It is quite probable that what is going on in Syria is linked to what Netanyahu was saying.
I think what's going on in Syria is so important and significant, because you look at these people who are, we'll call it Jabhat al-Nusra, it's something like this. And
that's right.
And the way that you see the people, these are not Syrians. Most of them coming from, we've learned, I saw a video that they were talking in Tajik, in Persian, and these are the same people. If you remember that terrorist attack in Crocus town hall in Russia, they were Tajiks and they did that terrorist attack. These are people who have been used by, they said in those days, they said it was ISIS-K. And right now in Idlib, in Aleppo, and they're doing the same thing. These are not Syrians. They have Syrians in their group, but other nationalities as well. And it's not a coincidence right after, in the day that they have announced a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, and we're having a new conflict, a new tension coming up in Syria. How do you see, because right now I think what's happening between Iran and Russia is so important in terms of what's going on in Syria, in terms of what's happening right now in Syria. Do you think that Iran and Russia would cooperate even closer? with what, considering what's going on there?
You are absolutely correct. This is a multinational terrorist organization or series of terrorist organizations. You have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was Jabhat al-Nusra before. You have a coalition of different groups, large numbers of Chinese nationals, large numbers of people from Central Asia, including the Tajiks that you were speaking about, large numbers of people from countries in North Africa and Asia in general. And these are the people that Mr. Erdogan has been supporting for 12, 13 years now. The rise of Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda in Syria was beginning of the dirty war that the Americans with NATO and Erdogan and oil and gas-rich countries in the Persian Gulf and Jordan and Israel were carried out. They began it in 2011, and it reached its height after 2013, where they brought in tens of thousands of foreign fighters. They were funded, and their travel to Syria was facilitated by Turkey and Jordan, but Turkey mostly. Many of them came from Europe as well, and Western intelligence agencies let them go. And the same thing happened, by the way, in Libya, in 2011. But in Syria, it was a very long-term project. So these people have been, some of them have been in Syria for well over a decade now. And Mr. Erdogan has, these different groups often clash with each other, they kill each other, they fight in Idlib, but it's clear that Mr. Erdogan has organized them, and now they've carried out this major assault, and the timing is extraordinary. Without a doubt, it will anger the Russians, because the area which they attacked was controlled by the Syrian army, and it was also a place where Russian forces were also based, and a number of Russians apparently have been murdered. The Iranian-supported groups, or the Iranians, they are not in that region, but I think Hezbollah is going to send some of its troops there, from what I've heard. And probably others will too. There will be reinforcements. Right now, the Russians are heavily bombing those areas, and so are the Syrians. But yes, I think it will be another reason for the Russians and the Iranians to work more closely with each other. And I think it further exposes the true nature of the dirty war in Syria, because during the previous years, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation about Syria. And most people were very hostile, ordinary people were very hostile towards Syria, because they didn't see the nature of the dirty war. The Western media was never telling the truth. If someone said something about it in Western media, they would be no longer invited. I remember Professor Sachs, I think, once went on MSNBC and explained that this is a dirty war. But these were very rare occasions when people would come and tell the truth in 2013, 14. And of course, the media in our part of the world, the Arabic media, is controlled by these dictatorships, and they were promoting sectarian language and sectarianism in order to undermine the Syrian government, because the Syrian government was the only government that was resisting Israel. All of these regimes were moving closer to Israel. Turkey had normalized with Israel. And so the media was very hostile towards the Syrian government. All of the lies about chemical weapons, they were universally accepted in the media. But what happened over the last year has exposed everything. Unless people are, hell-bent on preserving their old views, everyone sees that those people who carried out the dirty war in Syria are the ones who are supporting Israel. And they're the ones who are unwilling to do anything against the Israeli regime. And whereas the Syrians are supporting the resistance, whether in Palestine or in Lebanon. And this attack, I think, reinforces that. The timing is stunning. Literally hours after the battle begins or ends in Lebanon, or at least we have a ceasefire, or at least a cessation of hostilities, because again, Hezbollah has not accepted anything at the moment, then we have this huge battle. It's obvious that Mr. Erdogan and whoever's helping him uh, in the region, that they've been preparing for a very long time to carry out this major assault.
What are the main differences between Bashar al-Assad and Erdogan? Why they couldn't achieve any sort of agreement so far?
Well, first of all, Erdogan is a part of NATO, and he's kept Turkey in NATO, and he has no intention of leaving the Western camp. He speaks about BRICS and uh, maybe, yeah, and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and independent policies, but he hasn't really moved in that direction. His support for Palestine is basically giving some Palestinian scholarships and letting them study in Turkish universities, and to allow some of the Hamas officials to stay in their country, which benefits him more than it benefits them, because this is basically what the West also does. They give scholarships. They use that soft power to strengthen their hand. They create a good environment for people. But when Hamas needs their help in Gaza, he's still selling the oil and doing business and preserving ties. In Erdogan has ambitions over Syria. Syria and much of the region used to be a part of the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman sphere of influence. And Erdogan would like to see a revival of that. And his allies in Syria were a tool for that. And Erdogan did expect that Syria would collapse with all the foreign fighters that he brought in and all the weapons that he was sending in through countries, with the funding from the Persian Gulf region, with NATO support. He expected to win, and he failed. And now he has a problem. On the one hand, this has caused a burden because there are many refugees. Also, these extremists are dangerous. They're dangerous for Turkey. In Istanbul, they have a presence, and my Turkish friends always express concern about these groups and what they could possibly do inside Turkey or Turkey. And but also, he has a problem. On the one hand, he can't get rid of them, because if he does, it'll cause trouble at home. And on the other hand, they can be a useful tool for him to gain concessions from the Syrian government, because the Syrian government wants Turkey to withdraw its troops in order to normalize, which is a very reasonable condition. Mr. Erdogan wants to normalize without withdrawing his troops and without withdrawing those terror organizations that he supports. So while Turkey needs to have normalization, Erdogan is imposing conditions that are simply unacceptable for Syria. And by carrying out this assault, he hopes to put pressure on the Syrian government so that it would change its terms for negotiations. And on the other hand, Israelis have their own reasons to do this. So their interests coincide with one another. And of course, other countries in the region that have in the past supported these extremists have their own reasons as well. The very fact that the axis of resistance has succeeded so far, despite all the genocide, has hurt these regimes in the region that are pro-Western, among their own people, and in the eyes of regional public opinion, and in the eyes of people across the world who are opposed to genocide. So they would like to see Syria undermined and hurt and punished for the role that it played, which caused them all to look very bad.
I think one of the main questions right now would be why now? Why are they trying to attack Syria right now? And we have to come back to the conflict in the southern Lebanon and the way that the Syrian government was helping Lebanese people and Hezbollah. It seems that in the eyes of Israelis, as long as the Syrian government is helping Hezbollah, they're not capable of just destroying or damaging or making some sort of defeat and inflicting some sort of defeat on Hezbollah. That's why it seems to me that right after this ceasefire, they're going after the government in Syria. And it's so unbelievable. And how, as you mentioned, Erdogan just talking, he's not happy with the situation in Lebanon, in Gaza, but at the end of the day, what he's doing right now is in favor of Israel because he knows
I,
how important Syria is for Hezbollah.
and it's not just Lebanon. The Israeli regime wants to annex the occupied West Bank. And while King Abdullah of Jordan, like Erdogan, is cooperating very closely with the Israeli regime, uh, Syria is helping the occupied West Bank, despite efforts, at least through Syria, I should say, the Palestinians in the West Bank are receiving support, despite the efforts of the Jordanian regime to be Israel's border guard. And so if the regime wants to annex the West Bank and carry out major assaults, they would want to see Palestinians in the West Bank in a much weaker position. So that I think is also true. Mr. Erdogan, just as he in the north has been basically helping the Israeli regime, he hasn't sent a single bullet to Gaza nor to Lebanon, but he is arming these terrorists to carry out assaults in Syria with the most advanced technology. But in a sense, the same is happening in Jordan. Jordan, when the Israelis want to bomb Iran, they facilitate their air campaign. They allow the Americans to use their airspace. They allow the British to use their airspace. But also, and when the Iranians want to strike back, they facilitate the Western governments in their defense of the Israeli regime. But also, a lot of the Israeli airstrikes on Syria go through Jordan. They fly through Jordan and then go over the area occupied by the Americans, and then they go towards Aleppo, the place which is under attack. A lot of the airstrikes that the Israeli regime carries out against Syria are very far from the border area. They are near Aleppo, and now we know, and now we see that the attacks being carried out by Mr. Erdogan's groups and militias are towards Aleppo.
Yeah. And how do you see the role of Russia right now in terms of the way, because they have some sort of relationship and a different relationship because it's somehow strange between Russia and Turkey because the way that Turkey was helping Ukraine during this conflict in Ukraine and Russia tried to keep the relationship between the two countries. But right now in Syria, they're against each other. They're literally against each other. And do you see any sort of political movement on the part of Russia to convince Erdogan and his party and his people to just not attacking the way that they're trying to do it right now? We know how the timing is important right now. And everything, it seems, it, the way that Erdogan is playing, as you mentioned, is in favor of Israel. But how Russia can play a significant role, in your opinion?
I think this is going to definitely hurt the relationship because Russian soldiers have been killed and they've been humiliated online, and I think they've also taken prisoners, although I haven't seen the footage myself. So this is Mr. Erdogan's responsibility. These militia groups, these Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the others, all of these groups can only get their logistical support through Turkey because they're to the south, east, and west, it's Syria. and Syrian forces. Everything comes from Turkey. So Turkish military, the Turkish intelligence, they do everything. And so this is a Turkish government issue. This is Mr. Erdogan's little army that's fighting in Syria. So they can't escape responsibility. But also the footage that has come out, including footage of Chinese nationals, Central Asian nationals, these are not going to help Turkey because people in these countries are going to look and say, Mr. Erdogan is creating extremism with our nationals, And these people can come back home to our country to create death and destruction. So across Central Asia, governments will be concerned. The Chinese government will be concerned. The Russian government, not just because of the murder of Russian soldiers, but because of the possibility of terror attacks being carried out in Russia by these people, they are concerned. One of the problems that Mr. Erdogan has, morality aside, which he doesn't seem to have any moral compass. But many people used to praise him and say that Erdogan plays it very smart. He tilts to the east, he tilts to the west. One day he's with the Americans, and the next day he's with the Russians, and he does a deal with the Iranians, and he's with the Israelis. But in the long run, this creates distrust. No one is going to trust you. One reason why the axis of resistance is so effective is because they trust each other. Iran will never forsake Hamas. Iran will never forsake Ansarullah. Iran will never forsake Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad or the Hashid. Iran will help them under all different situations. Iran is arming them as we speak. I say this, of course, as a person who doesn't have any confidential information, but it's clear. So, and that is a huge burden for Iran. Iran will not back down. Iran will not sacrifice them. And this coming strike against the Israeli regime, although it will be a retaliation for Israeli aggression, but it will be to help the Palestinians. It will be to help the resistance. And it is costly for Iran. So one reason why the axis of resistance is so strong is because they trust each other, is because they have faith in each other. But no one is going to trust Mr. Erdogan. Russia will never trust him. Iran cannot trust him. Syria cannot trust him. The Europeans cannot trust him. No one can trust him. And that, I think, is very hurtful for Turkey. And I think that while he was an effective leader during his first decade in power, after that, I think things have changed, and for Turkey, and not just economically, but socially, and also for the image of Turkey because of Mr. Erdogan. Ordinary Turks are very supportive of the Palestinian cause, very supportive from all political persuasions, but their government does not reflect their sentiments.
As we talk, we've learned that an Egyptian delegation arrives in Israel today to talk about the ceasefire in Gaza. And how do you see the possibility of having a ceasefire in Gaza? And what would that mean? Because as you've mentioned, the situation with the West Bank and with the northern part of Gaza is critical right now, because we know that the Israeli government wants to annex these two parts. And how do you see the move on the part of the Egyptian government? And are they connected with Hamas, or they're doing it on them because on the basis of their policy?
I don't know at all if they are in contact with Hamas at the moment, but I did forget to mention something which was very important, and that is that Trump is coming to power. And Trump has already said, as we all know, that he told Netanyahu, or it has been said, that he has told Netanyahu to end this. So Netanyahu, I think, is, in my opinion, again, I think that the outgoing Biden regime is probably not happy with him and would like to see Netanyahu hurt. And the incoming Trump regime, they want to see this problem off their plate. They don't want to see the problem in front of them when they come to power. So that, I think, does put pressure on Netanyahu to accept some sort of ceasefire. I have no idea if that will happen. Hamas, they are continuing to fight against the Israeli regime in Gaza. So is the Islamic Jihad. The Israeli regime constantly attacks the West Bank and kills people there, something that the Western media never talks about. But in the West Bank, Islamic Jihad and Hamas, I think I think that Islamic Jihad has a stronger presence in the West Bank than it does in Gaza. But these groups, as well as other groups, they are all they're all powerful. They're very effective and powerful. So the Israelis are tired. They're isolated. They're despised. And they're also under pressure to end this. I think Biden would like to see Netanyahu. I think his people at least would like to see Netanyahu humiliated, and to a degree, not Israel, but him. And Trump just wants not to have this problem.
And it seems that the conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East are connected much more than we have expected to be, because we see the role of Russia and in the Middle East and the way that they're talking about it in Ukraine. But how do you see, even on the Russian part, we had some sort of hope with the Trump administration to make some sort of changes, to make some sort of new political movements toward Russia, maybe closer to Russia. Right now, with the new appointments, with new people coming to the Trump administration, it's every time we hear someone new is coming to the administration, it's getting worse, it's not getting better. and here comes the question, are Iran and Russia getting to the point that they're just giving up on the United States and their policy because they've been betrayed by the United States and their policymakers so
Well,
many
I think
times?
I think it's very fair to say that the Iranians and Russians are skeptical, highly skeptical, to say the least. And I think there is a strong link between what is going on in Ukraine and what is going on in Palestine, in Lebanon, and in West Asia in general. And I think the more the West escalates, the closer the relationship becomes between the Russian government and those forces in West Asia that are opposed to the United States. And the same is true with China as well. I think it causes them to tilt further away from the West and to support non-Western actors because they see the United States as becoming increasingly aggressive, and it's dangerous for them. A weak Iran is not good for China. A weak Russia is not good for China. A weak Russia is not good for Iran, and a weak Iran is not good for Russia. So I think that these are all important elements that are taken into account. There are some reports that, for example, the Russians are giving weapons to Yemen. I don't know if that's really true, but I think that the Russians would probably be helping Iran more. Iran helps Russia more. The Iranian and Russian military cooperation has expanded dramatically over the past few years, and their political cooperation. The Americans, the more, therefore, that they escalate, and the more the Europeans escalate, the greater the incentive is for the Russians to retaliate. Their retaliation can come in the form of hypersonic missiles, but it can also come in the form of greater cooperation with the Axis of Resistance and the Islamic Republic of Iran, where they could hurt the Americans and their allies in a different way. So in general, it's very the link is very strong, and I think that although you cannot really be 100% sure about what is going to happen in the United States, some say that Trump is appointing these madmen in order to be the bad cop, and then Trump would be the good cop. It doesn't sound like a reasonable way to do diplomacy, but that is a theory. But I think that the skepticism is enormous, and these people are going to have a very negative influence, and they're going to create mistrust. And so, Russia is not going to, after all the gains that it has made, especially in recent months, they're not going to relinquish those gains and give up the momentum because of Donald Trump. They've made too many sacrifices, and they have expectations. And therefore, the gap that exists between the United States and Russia now or under Trump is going to be enormous. If Trump capitulates, or if Trump gives what the Russians want and demand, then he will be seen as a traitor by his opponents. And his opponents hate him. And even in our region, I imagine that many of those people who are silent over the Holocaust in Gaza and the genocidal attacks in Lebanon because they wanted Biden or Harris to come into power, they would like to hammer Trump with genocide and even though most of them, even though in the Democratic Party the elites fully support the Israeli regime, but the ordinary people, they are very critical of the regime. So I'm sure that many people who were quiet until now, they will start going to the streets and protesting. Life, Trump cannot concede too much in Ukraine without being humiliated at home by his enemies. And they hate him, even though he won big. But I think the hatred for him is probably even greater than in 2016 and 2020, from what I'm seeing. And in our region also, Trump, if he escalates too much alongside the Israelis, the opposition at home, I think, will become very difficult for him to manage, especially since he said that he is against the wars. And of course, he is a serial liar. There's no doubt about that. But it does make it all the more difficult for him, because he said, look, I want to make America great again. And then he starts off with escalation in Palestine or with Iran or with Russia. I think it's going to hurt him, especially with the U.S. economy doing so poorly and, according to many, heading towards a very major crisis. So the link is very strong. The link is there between the events in Europe and in West Asia. That has caused a strengthening of ties between Iran and Russia. And I think the events in Syria are only going to make it stronger. And the foolishness of killing Russian soldiers in the area between Idlib and Aleppo, I think is only going to complicate matters further and push Iran and Russia towards even further cooperation on this particular front as well.
As you know, the Russian army has used a new hypersonic missile called Oreshnik in Ukraine, and which many people that I've talked with, they're believing that it's a game changer in terms of military advancement. Before that, we had Iranian officials, before all of these happening, one of the Iranian officials said that we don't need nuclear bombs. We have something much more powerful. And many people are asking in the West that what does it mean? And what's your interpretation of this statement on the part of Iranian officials?
Well, I don't know any military secrets in this country, but there are a few things that I can say, and it's information that you know as well as I. First of all, we should wait for the Iranian strike on Israel. And I think we'll better understand how powerful Iran's missile capabilities are. And also Iran's defense capabilities, which have shown themselves to be pretty impressive when the Israeli regime tried to strike Iran, but that's another issue. So that's something that we will be seeing soon. But I think the most important thing that in the West that they should consider, or the two things that they should always keep in mind, is A, if there's any attack on Iran's nuclear program, Iran's nuclear posture will change. Or if there's some sort of threat to Iran's existence, Iran's nuclear posture will change. That has been said repeatedly by Dr. Kharazi, who is the leader's foreign policy advisor. And obviously, since he said it repeatedly over the last year and a half, that means he has the authority to say that. It's not something that he said and it was a mistake, or he retracted, or he didn't repeat. Second is that Iran is a nuclear threshold state. Its nuclear program is peaceful. It's always been peaceful. There's no real evidence that Iran, even before, even 2 decades ago, was really pursuing a nuclear weapon. There's no evidence. But Iran is a nuclear threshold state, and it's one of the 10 most developed countries in the world when it comes to nuclear technology. Iran's missile technology is clear for everyone to see, and we will see more of it shortly. So they should put 2 and 2 together. I remember I was on Al Jazeera once, very years ago, when Iran said that it's going to enrich uranium at 20%. And I was on with a Western nuclear scientist. And he started explaining how it would take months for Iran to do this. And I knowing very little about the most basic elements of physics, only what I read in high school, and I don't remember that either. I said that Iran will enrich uranium at 20% very swiftly because they said they'll do it. Hours later, Iran did it. Hours later. So the West likes to underestimate Iran, and that is a part of this Orientalist, top to bottom worldview that they have, underestimating the brown people and the other and so on. They should not underestimate Iran's capabilities. And when Iran says that its nuclear program is well protected, Israelis won't be able to destroy it. It is deep underground. I don't think the Americans could destroy it, even if they wanted to. And Iran would definitely quickly leave the NPT and do what it feels it needs to do wherever it will do it. So the West should not push Iran for a nuclear weapon. The West should make sure that Iran does not go in that direction. The way to do it is to yank on the leash of those who want to push things in the wrong direction. Iran does not want a nuclear weapon. The reason is because it creates instability across the region. If Iran develops a nuclear weapon, then other countries want to develop nuclear weapons. Then you're going to have lots of countries with nuclear weapons, and many of them are run by dictators, family dictatorships. Many of these regimes are unstable. Saudi Arabia is a country which is named after a family. It's a tribal country. A lot of these countries could grow unstable. Look at what happened to Libya. After the Americans destroyed the government, the country fell apart. So imagine in Libya if some rogue elements had obtained a nuclear weapon, let's say, if there were nuclear weapons there at the time. So Iran doesn't want to create this environment in West Asia or Central Asia where countries all have nuclear weapons, because it's a horrible thing. Remember, during the Iran-Iraq War, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein they were giving him chemical weapons. They gave the military intelligence to use it. They gave him the political cover. Iran did not choose to create nuclear weapons, chemical weapons. The leader back then said, no, it's forbidden. These are horrible weapons. I was injured twice with chemical weapons. Once I was injured the first time, I was injured with a nerve agent among friends. We were all injured. And the second, which was more, in my opinion, a more terrifying weapon, It was mustard gas near the end of the war. Many died. Many even now continue to slowly die over many years. They can't breathe, But in any case, the Iranians refused to produce those chemical weapons. And so I understand Iran's position. But if Iran is forced to have nuclear weapons, they will get them very quickly. And they should remember what I was saying about the 20%. They should not underestimate Iran and Iran's capabilities. The second is that if there's a conflict, because Israel is too weak to fight any war with Iran, they will lose. And so its only hope is that the Americans would get involved. If the Americans get involved, they should keep in mind that Iran has hundreds of thousands of missiles and drones underground in countless underground missile and drone bases. And American bases in the Persian Gulf and the region would be destroyed. But far more important than the American bases is the fact that those countries that host them, or those regimes that host them, they will be seen as aggressors. They will be seen as a part of the aggression. Their infrastructure will be destroyed. That would mean no more gas. That would mean no more oil. Even if the Americans carry out a small strike and the Iranians retaliate in a limited way, that would drive up the price of oil and gas, enormously. And if it's a full-blown war, then there will be no more oil and gas coming from this region. And that will destroy the global economy. So there is a balance of terror between Iran and the United States in that regard. So I think the West should rethink their policies. The world has changed. The West is not the power that it was before. It created this situation, especially with its foolish economic policies, from the 1980s and especially the 1990s, the deindustrialization of much of the West, and then the change and laws and the consolidation of wealth and the collapse of the middle class and the endless wars that began after 9/11. They brought it upon themselves. But the world today is a very different world than in 1991, when the United States came in and created a huge coalition to fight against Saddam Hussein. And there is reason to believe, there is evidence that actually Saddam Hussein in Kuwait did not fire because there was a deal between him and the West where his forces would be expelled from Kuwait and he would not be overthrown. And when their forces were expelled, when there was an uprising in Iraq, the Americans allowed him to use his helicopters to crush the protesters and the people who wanted to overthrow him. So there is reason to believe that there was a deal struck between Saddam Hussein and the West back then. But that aside, this is not 1991. The United States is not that power. And Iran, the axis of, when Yemen, despite the B-52 and B-2 bombers and other bombers striking Yemen, they've shut the gates to the Red Sea. Iran is infinitely more powerful. So the West should rethink its policies. Instead of trying to be the masters of the earth, like they used to be, they should recognize that this 500 years of domination is very, very rapidly coming to an end.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much for having me.